Rain hammered the castle windows like 1,000 fists demanding to be let in, and Alina Whitmore stood frozen in the dark hallway, her heart pounding so loud she was certain the whole house could hear it. Somewhere behind her, a door slammed. Footsteps, fast, coming closer. She pressed herself into the shadow of a stone pillar and held her breath, praying she would not be found before she reached the gate. 3 hours earlier, everything had still made sense. Alina had arrived at Ashcombe Castle on a gray autumn afternoon, her single travel case in hand, and her letter of employment folded carefully in her coat pocket. She was 24 years old, with no family left to speak of and no fortune to her name, but she had a steady mind and a gentle way with people who were sick or frightened, and that was exactly what the Ashcombe household needed. The Duke's mother, Lady Margaret, had been unwell for months, and the doctors had recommended a companion who could sit with her, read to her, and ease the long hours of illness. The housekeeper, a sharp-eyed woman named Mrs. Prescott, had met Alina at the door and looked her up and down before nodding once, as if deciding she would do. "The Duke does not like disruptions," Mrs. Prescott had said, leading her through halls lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors. "Keep to your duties, speak when spoken to, and you will get along fine here." Alina had nodded, clutching her case a little tighter. She was used to being invisible in grand houses. It suited her mostly. Invisible people did not get hurt. She met Lady Margaret first, a frail but sharp-tongued woman propped up on pillows in a sunlit room at the top of the East Tower. The old woman studied Alina with clear blue eyes that seemed to see straight through pretense. "You're younger than I expected," Lady Margaret said. "I hope that isn't a problem, my lady." "It might be. My son does not trust young people. He does not trust much of anyone these days." Lady Margaret's mouth twitched, somewhere between a smile and a wince. "But I like you already. Sit down, girl. Tell me something true about yourself, before the whole house teaches you to lie." Alina sat, surprised into a small laugh. "I grew up in a fishing village. My mother died when I was 12, my father when I was 19. I have been working in other people's houses ever since, and I have gotten rather good at it." "Good at what, working?" "Good at being useful without being noticed." Lady Margaret's eyes softened. "That is a sad skill for someone so young to have mastered. We will have to see if we can't teach you a new one while you're here." It was, Alina would later think, the kindest thing anyone had said to her in years. She did not meet the Duke that first day, nor the second. She heard about him constantly, from the maids who lowered their voices when they mentioned him, from the stable hands who spoke of him with a strange mixture of respect and fear, from Lady Margaret herself, who sighed whenever his name came up, as though speaking of an old wound that had never properly healed. "My son was not always so cold," Lady Margaret told her one evening as Alina adjusted the blankets around her. "He used to laugh, truly laugh, the kind that shakes a room. That was before." "Before what, my lady?" Lady Margaret's gaze drifted to the window, to the dark shapes of the hills beyond the castle walls. "Before he learned that people are not always what they seem. It changed him. I am afraid it changed him for good." Alina did not ask more. It was not her place, and besides, she had learned long ago that people revealed their pain when they were ready, and not a moment before. She finally saw the Duke on the third evening, and it was nothing like she expected. She had been sent to fetch a book from the library, an old volume of poetry that Lady Margaret wanted read aloud before bed, and she had not thought to knock before entering, since the room was rarely used at that hour. The moment she stepped inside, she realized her mistake. A man stood by the tall windows, one hand braced against the frame, staring out at the storm gathering over the hills. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark coat that seemed to absorb what little firelight there was in the room. He turned at the sound of the door, and Alina found herself looking into a pair of eyes so guarded, so carefully blank, that it took her breath away for a moment before she remembered to curtsy. "Forgive me, Your Grace, I did not know anyone was here." Clearly, his voice was low, controlled, giving nothing away. "You are the new companion for my mother." "Yes, Your Grace, Alina Whitmore." He studied her for a long moment, the way a man might study a stranger who had wandered onto his land without permission, not unkindly, but with a wariness that made her skin prickle. "See that you do your job well, Miss Whitmore. My mother is not to be tired out, upset, or given false hope about her condition. Do you understand?" "I understand, Your Grace." "Good." He turned back to the window, and Alina understood the conversation was over. She took the book from the shelf as quietly as she could and left, her heart beating strangely fast, though she could not have said why. Later, lying awake in her small room in the servants' wing, she replayed the moment in her mind. There had been something underneath the coldness in his eyes, something tired, something wounded, something that did not match the stern reputation the household had built around him. She told herself it did not matter. She was here to care for his mother, nothing more. Dukes did not concern themselves with companions, and companions who forgot their place did not last long in houses like this one. She fell asleep to the sound of rain against her window, not knowing that the storm outside was only the first of many that would shape the months ahead. The days settled into a rhythm after that. Alina rose early, helped Lady Margaret dress and eat, read to her through the long mornings, walked with her in the castle gardens when her strength allowed it, and sat with her through the quiet afternoons when the old woman's energy faded, and she needed nothing more than company and silence. Alina did not mind the quiet. She had spent so much of her life listening to the silences of other people's houses that she had learned to find comfort in them. She saw the Duke rarely at first, a distant figure crossing the courtyard on horseback, a shadow passing the library door, a voice heard through walls, discussing estate matters with his steward in a tone that brooked no argument. The staff spoke of him the way people speak of weather that cannot be controlled, only endured. He was fair, they said, and paid well and never cruel. But he was also unreachable, a man who had built a wall so high around himself that even his own household could not see over it. It was Lady Margaret who first hinted at why. "He was engaged once," she said one afternoon as Alina arranged flowers by the window, "to a young woman named Charlotte, beautiful girl, clever too, or so we thought." Lady Margaret's hands, resting in her lap, tightened slightly. 3 days before the wedding she left. No note, no warning. We searched everywhere, feared the worst until we learned the truth. She had run off with his own brother, Edmund. Alina's hands stilled on the flowers. His brother. Half-brother from my late husband's first marriage. There was always tension between them, but none of us imagined. Lady Margaret shook her head. Alexander never spoke of it again, not once in 5 years, but something in him closed that day, like a door being locked from the inside. He does not trust easily now. He does not trust at all if he can help it. Alina thought of the Duke's guarded eyes in the library, the careful blankness of his voice, and felt something shift in her chest, not quite pity, because pity was not what a man like that would want, but something close to understanding. She knew what it was to have the ground taken out from under you without warning. She knew what it was to learn, too young, that the people you trusted most could vanish, could betray you, could leave you standing alone in a life you no longer recognized. "Thank you for telling me, my lady," she said quietly. "I will remember it." "See that you do." Lady Margaret's eyes were sharp again, studying her. "And Alina, be careful with him, not because he is dangerous. Because he is breakable, in a way he would never admit, and I think you might be the first person in years who could actually reach him." Alina laughed the comment off at the time, certain the old woman was imagining things. She was a companion, hired for a wage, with no family and no name that mattered in circles like these. Men like the Duke of Ashcombe did not fall for women like her. It was not how the world worked, and she had learned long ago not to waste her hope on things that were not meant for her. But that evening, walking back from the kitchens with a tray of tea for Lady Margaret's nightly medicine, she crossed paths with the Duke in the long gallery, and something in the quiet of the empty hall made the moment feel different from their first meeting. He was standing before one of the old portraits, a painting of a woman Alina did not recognize, her eyes distant, her expression unreadable in the dim light. "My mother when she was young," he said without turning around, though he must have heard her footsteps. "Before I was born, I like to look at it sometimes. She was happier then, I think. less worn down by illness, less worn down by me probably." Alina stopped, unsure whether she was meant to respond. "I don't think she considers you a burden, Your Grace. She speaks of you often, and fondly." He turned then, and there was something almost startled in his expression, as though he had not expected her to answer, or perhaps had not expected anyone to bother. "Fondly," he repeated, testing the word like it did not quite fit. "That is not the word most people would use to describe how she feels about me these days. I have not exactly been an easy son to love." "I don't think love works that way," Alina said before she could stop herself. "I don't think it needs a person to be easy, just present." Something flickered across his face, surprise, maybe, or the ghost of an old ache. For a moment the wall around him seemed to lower, just slightly, just enough that Alina caught a glimpse of the man underneath it. Tired, lonely, carrying a weight that had nothing to do with dukedoms or estates. "You speak plainly, Miss Whitmore. I was taught that honesty is more useful than manners, Your Grace. Manners can hide too much." A faint sound escaped him, not quite a laugh, but close enough that Alina felt a small, unexpected warmth bloom in her chest. "That is a dangerous philosophy to hold in a house like this one," he said. "Most people here have spent years learning exactly how to hide behind manners." "Then perhaps this house needs a little less hiding." He looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes, and then he gave a small nod as though she had said something worth considering. "Perhaps it does," he murmured. "Good night, Miss Whitmore." "Good night, Your Grace." She walked away with her tray, her pulse unsteady, telling herself firmly that it had been nothing more than a brief, ordinary exchange between an employer and a servant. But she could not quite make herself believe it. There had been something in his eyes when the wall came down, something that made her wonder, just for a moment, if Lady Margaret had been right after all, if she truly was the first person in years who might reach the man hidden behind the Duke's cold reputation. She did not know yet how much that thought would come to cost her, nor how far she would run from Ashcombe Castle before the truth finally caught up to her, carried on horseback through a violent storm, calling her name into the dark. Winter crept into the hills around Ashcombe Castle slowly, turning the gardens brown and the mornings frosty, and with it came a strange new rhythm to Alina's days. She still spent her mornings with Lady Margaret, still read the old poetry books aloud until her voice went hoarse, still helped the old woman into her shawls before their short walks along the covered terrace. But now, more often than not, the Duke found reasons to be nearby. He never announced it. He simply appeared, crossing the terrace as Alina and Lady Margaret took their afternoon air, or sitting at the far end of the library table while Alina searched the shelves for a new volume to read that evening. At first, Alina told herself it was coincidence, or perhaps concern for his mother's well-being. But the visits grew too frequent, too well-timed, to be anything but deliberate. "He watches you when he thinks no one notices," Lady Margaret said one afternoon, amusement lighting her tired eyes. "My son has never been subtle, though he believes himself to be a master of it." "I'm sure he is only checking on your care, my lady." "My care?" Lady Margaret snorted softly. "Alina, dear, I have needed very little checking on these past 20 years, and he has never once bothered before you arrived." Alina said nothing, though her cheeks warmed, and she busied herself refilling the teapot to hide it. The truth was, she had begun to notice things about the Duke that no one else in the household seemed to see. She noticed that he was gentler with his mother than his reputation suggested, sitting with her sometimes in the evenings, listening patiently as she recounted old memories he had surely heard 100 times before. She noticed that he was fair to the staff, remembering the names of even the newest kitchen maids, asking after a groundskeeper's ill wife, quietly covering a stable boy's unpaid debts without ever mentioning it to anyone. He was not cold, not truly. He was careful. There was a difference, and Alina was beginning to understand it. One afternoon in late November, she found him in the walled garden behind the east wing, standing beside the bare rose bushes with his hands clasped behind his back, staring at nothing in particular. She had come to cut a few of the last hardy blooms for Lady Margaret's room, and had not expected company. "Forgive me, Your Grace, I didn't realize anyone was out here." "You keep apologizing for interrupting me, Miss Whitmore. I am beginning to think you believe I spend all my time standing in empty rooms, waiting to be disturbed." There was the faintest curve to his mouth as he said it, not quite a smile, but close enough that Alina felt her own lips lift in response. "Don't you, Your Grace?" He huffed out something that might have been a laugh surprised out of him. "Occasionally, it is a large castle and empty rooms are not in short supply." "That sounds lonely." The humor faded slightly from his expression, replaced by something more thoughtful. "It is what I have grown used to," he said. "I find I do not mind it most days." "And on the days you do mind it." He glanced at her, something searching in his gaze as though weighing how much of an answer she truly deserved. "On those days," he said slowly, "I have found myself walking toward wherever you happen to be, which is, I imagine, not a coincidence you have failed to notice." Alina's breath caught. She had not expected him to say it so plainly, this careful, guarded man who kept the whole world at arm's length. "I had noticed," she admitted quietly. "I wasn't certain what to make of it." "Neither am I, if I am honest." He looked down at the bare rose bush beside him, running a thumb absently over one of its thorns. "I had decided, a long time ago, that it was safer not to want things. Wanting things gives them the power to be taken away. That's a hard way to live." "It is a safe way to live." His eyes met hers again, and there was something raw in them now, something that made her chest ache. "But I find, lately, that safety has begun to feel a great deal like being asleep, and you, Miss Whitmore, have an unfortunate habit of waking me up." Alina did not know what to say to that. She stood in the cold garden, her basket of half-cut roses forgotten at her side, and felt something shift irreversibly in her chest. A small, dangerous hope she had not allowed herself to feel in years. "I don't know if that's a compliment, Your Grace." "Neither do I," he admitted, and this time the smile that crossed his face was real, brief, and startled, as though it surprised even him. "Ask me again once I've decided." He left her there among the roses, and Alina stood for a long while after he had gone, her heart beating too fast, telling herself firmly that nothing had truly changed. He was still a duke. She was still a companion with no name, no fortune, no right to hope for anything more than a wage and a warm bed for the winter. But some part of her, some quiet and long-buried part, had begun to hope anyway. It was around this time that the household staff began to whisper more openly, their voices dropping whenever Alina passed, their glances following her down the halls with a mixture of curiosity and unease. She caught fragments of their conversation. A maid named Clara, who had become something of a friend over the past weeks, warned her gently one evening as they folded linens together. "You should be careful," Clara said, not unkindly. "People are starting to talk about you and the Duke." Alina's hands stilled on the fabric. "There's nothing to talk about. I care for his mother, that's all." "Maybe so, but he looks at you like there's more than that, and people notice these things. This house has long memories, Alina. They haven't forgotten what happened with Lady Charlotte, and they're watching closely to see if history's about to repeat itself." "I would never do what she did," Alina said quietly, a flash of anger warming her voice despite herself. "I would never hurt him like that." Clara's expression softened. "I believe you, but belief and proof are different things, especially in a house full of people who have been burned once already. Just be careful, that's all I'm saying." Alina took the warning to heart, though she was not entirely sure how to heed it. She could not control the Duke's growing attention any more than she could control her own growing feelings, and pretending otherwise felt like a lie she did not have the strength to maintain. So she continued as she always had, caring for Lady Margaret, keeping to her duties and allowing herself, in small and private moments, to enjoy the quiet company of a man who was slowly, carefully, letting down his guard. It was in one of those quiet moments, a week before the first heavy snow, that everything began to change. Alina had been walking back from the stables at dusk, having delivered a message to the head groom on Lady Margaret's behalf, when she heard the sound of hoofbeats on the drive, fast, urgent, out of place among the castle's usual slow rhythms. She turned to see a rider approaching through the gathering dark, his horse lathered with sweat despite the cold, and something in her stomach tightened with unease before she even saw his face clearly. He dismounted with easy, practiced grace, tossing the reins to a startled stable boy without so much as a glance, and turned toward the castle with the confident stride of a man who had walked these halls many times before. He was handsome in a sharp, calculated sort of way, his coat well tailored, his smile quick and charming as he caught sight of Alina standing near the stable door. "Well now," he said, his eyes moving over her with an appraising interest that made her skin crawl faintly, though she could not have said why. "I don't believe we've met, and I make it a point to know every pretty face in this household." "I'm Miss Whitmore," Alina said carefully, dropping a small, polite curtsy. "Companion to Lady Margaret." Ah, something shifted behind his eyes, recognition, perhaps, or calculation. "The new companion. I've heard a great deal about you already, and I've only just arrived." His smile widened, showing teeth. "I'm Reginald Ashcombe, the Duke's cousin. I do hope we'll be great friends, Miss Whitmore." Alina felt the unease in her stomach deepen into something closer to dread, though she could not have explained why. Not yet. She only knew, with the quiet certainty of someone who had learned to read danger in a person's eyes long before their words gave them away, that Reginald Ashcombe's arrival was not going to be a welcome one. "Welcome to Ashcombe Castle, Mr. Ashcombe," she said carefully, and turned to walk toward the house before he could say anything further, though she could feel his eyes following her the entire way, sharp and considering, like a man already plotting his next move on a board she did not yet know she was playing on. That night over the evening meal she took quietly in the servants' hall, Alina listened as the staff spoke of Reginald in hushed, wary tones. "He only ever comes when he wants something," one of the older footmen muttered. "Money, usually, or to remind the Duke that he's next in line should anything happen." "He hates that the Duke never remarried," Clara added quietly, leaning close. "Every year without an heir is another year Reginald stays first in line for the title. He's not going to be happy about anything, or anyone, that might change that." Alina thought of the sharp calculation in Reginald's eyes as he had looked at her in the fading light, and felt a cold certainty settle in her chest. Whatever fragile, hopeful thing had begun to grow between herself and the Duke, she understood suddenly and completely that Reginald Ashcombe intended to see it destroyed before it could become anything more, and that he would not particularly care what methods he used to do it. She did not sleep well that night, listening to the wind pick up outside her window, the first true storm of the season gathering somewhere over the hills, as if the sky itself understood that something was about to change at Ashcombe Castle, and not for the better. The storm arrived 3 days after Reginald's arrival, rolling in over the hills with a violence that rattled the castle's old windows and sent the staff scurrying to close shutters and check that every fire was properly banked. Alina spent the early evening with Lady Margaret, who had grown tired earlier than usual and asked to be settled into bed before the worst of the weather hit. "You look troubled, dear," Lady Margaret said as Alina tucked the blankets around her. "Is it the storm or is it my nephew?" Alina hesitated, unwilling to burden the old woman with her worries. "Both, perhaps, my lady." Reginald has always had a talent for unsettling people. It is one of his few consistent qualities. Lady Margaret's eyes, tired but sharp, studied Alina's face. "Do not let him trouble you more than necessary. He is loud and clever, but he is not as clever as he believes himself to be, and my son is not as foolish as Reginald hopes." "I hope you're right, my lady." "I am usually right. It is one of the benefits of being old." Lady Margaret's hand found Alina's, squeezing it gently. "Go on now, get some rest before this storm gets any worse. And Alina, thank you for everything these past weeks. I have not felt this cared for in a very long time." Alina's throat tightened unexpectedly, and she pressed a gentle kiss to the back of the old woman's hand before leaving the room, her heart fuller and heavier than she had expected. She did not go straight to her own quarters. The storm had grown loud enough that sleep felt impossible, and restlessness pulled her instead toward the library, where a fire was always kept lit through the evening hours and a good book might, she hoped, quiet the uneasy churn of her thoughts. She was not entirely surprised to find the Duke already there. He stood near the tall windows, much as he had the first evening she had seen him, watching the storm lash against the glass with an intensity that suggested his thoughts were far from peaceful. He turned as she entered, and something in his expression eased slightly at the sight of her, a small, unguarded relief that he did not seem to notice himself displaying. "Miss Whitmore, I did not expect company tonight. I couldn't sleep. The storm—" "Nor could I," he gestured toward the fire, an unspoken invitation, and Alina found herself crossing the room to sit in the chair opposite his, the warmth of the flames a welcome contrast to the storm's chill seeping through the old stone walls. "My cousin's arrival has a way of disturbing the peace of this house even without the help of the weather." "You don't seem fond of him." "I am not fond of him. I tolerate him because he is family, and because my mother has a soft spot for him that I have never fully understood." Alexander's jaw tightened slightly. He has always resented that I hold the title he believes should have gone to him had circumstances been different. He does not hide it well, though he believes he does. "He was watching me earlier. In a way I didn't much care for." Something dark flickered across the Duke's face, not quite anger but close to it, protective in a way that startled Alina with its intensity. "If he troubles you in any way, you are to tell me immediately. Do you understand? I will not have him treating you as though you are beneath his notice or beneath his cruelty." "I can manage myself, Your Grace. I've had practice." "I don't doubt it," his voice softened. "But you should not have to manage it alone, not here, not while I have any say in the matter." The fire crackled between them, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the storm outside filling the silence with its low, constant roar. Alina studied his face in the firelight, the sharp lines of it softened by the warm glow, the careful guardedness in his eyes loosening the longer they sat together in the quiet. "Can I ask you something, Your Grace?" "You may." "Do you ever regret it, closing yourself off the way you have since—" She hesitated, unsure if she had overstepped. "Since Charlotte," he finished for her, and though his voice tightened slightly at the name, he did not seem angry that she had asked. "I used to think it was the only sensible choice left to me. Trust no one, want nothing, and no one can ever hurt you the way she did." He looked into the fire, his expression distant. "But lately, I have begun to wonder if I only traded one kind of pain for another, a quieter one perhaps, but no less lonely. I'm sorry for what she did to you." "Don't be. If she had not left, I would never have learned what I know now, that a person can rebuild themselves into someone stronger, even after being broken, and I would never have met you." His eyes lifted to hers, steady and unguarded in a way Alina had never seen from him before. "I did not expect to feel this way again, Alina. I want you to know that. I did not think it was possible for me anymore." Her breath caught at the sound of her given name in his voice, soft and careful, as though he were testing whether he had earned the right to use it. "Alexander," she said quietly, and watched something in his face open entirely at the sound of his own name spoken so gently. He rose from his chair and crossed the small distance between them, kneeling before her seat so that their eyes were level, his hand reaching up to brush a strand of hair from her face with a tenderness that made her heart ache. "I know this is not simple," he murmured. "I know what the world will say, what my family will say about a duke and his mother's companion. But I find for the first time in 5 years that I do not particularly care what the world says. I only care what you say." "Alexander, The library door burst open with a force that sent it crashing against the wall, and both of them startled apart, Alexander rising quickly to his feet as Reginald strode into the room, rainwater dripping from his coat, his expression a careful mask of polite surprise that did not quite hide the sharp, satisfied glint in his eyes. "Forgive the interruption," Reginald said smoothly, though his gaze moved between them with obvious, deliberate interest. "I did not realize the library was occupied by such intimate company." "Reginald!" Alexander's voice had gone cold, controlled once more, the warmth of moments before vanishing behind the familiar wall. "Is there something you needed?" only to inform you that a rider has arrived with urgent news from the northern estate. Some trouble with the tenants, I believe. I thought you would want to know immediately." Reginald's eyes flicked to Alina, lingering a beat too long, calculating. "Though I see you were rather occupied." "I will attend to it directly." Alexander's tone made clear the conversation was finished, and Reginald, after another lingering glance at Alina that made her skin crawl, inclined his head and left the room, though not before Alina caught the small, satisfied curve of his mouth as he turned away. Alexander turned back to her, something apologetic in his expression. "I am sorry, I must go and see to this." But Alina, he reached for her hand, pressing it briefly, warmly between both of his own. "This conversation is not finished. I meant every word I said tonight, and I intend to say it again properly when we are not interrupted by unwelcome company." "I understand," Alina said softly, though something cold had settled in her chest at the memory of Reginald's calculating eyes, a warning she could not quite shake even as Alexander pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles before hurrying from the room. She sat alone by the fire for a long while after he had gone, her heart full of a fragile, terrifying hope, and beneath it, a quiet unease she could not name but could not ignore either, the growing certainty that whatever had begun to bloom between herself and the Duke tonight, Reginald Ashcombe had already begun plotting how best to tear it apart. She was right to worry. Within a week the whispers would start, quiet and poisonous, working their way through the household like smoke through the halls of the old castle, and by the time Alina understood how deep the damage went, it would already be far too late to stop it. The change in the household was slow at first, so slow that Alina almost did not notice it happening until it had already taken root. A maid who had once smiled warmly when passing her in the hall now looked away, murmuring something under her breath to the girl beside her. A footman who had always greeted her politely now offered only a stiff nod before hurrying past. Even Mrs. Prescott, the housekeeper, had begun watching her with a narrowed, assessing gaze that made Alina's skin prickle with unease every time she felt it on her back. It was Clara who finally told her the truth, pulling her into an empty linen room one afternoon with a grim, worried expression that made Alina's stomach drop before a single word had been spoken. "There's talk going around," Clara said quietly, closing the door behind them. "Ugly talk. About you." "What kind of talk?" "That you've been working your way into the Duke's favor on purpose. That you took this position knowing his mother was ill and vulnerable, hoping to use her to get close to him. Some are even saying you've been stealing from the household. Small things. Money left unaccounted for, a bracelet gone missing from Lady Margaret's room." Alina felt the blood drain from her face. "None of that is true, Clara. You know it isn't." "I know," Clara said quickly, gripping her hands. "I've told anyone who'll listen that it's nonsense. But it's spreading fast, Alina, faster than I've ever seen rumors spread in this house, and I don't think it's spreading on its own." "Reginald." Clara nodded grimly. "He's been talking to the staff." Quietly, carefully, never anything that could be traced directly back to him, but always in the right ears, at the right moments. "I think he means to have you dismissed before the Duke can make his intentions toward you known publicly." Alina's hands were trembling by the time Clara finished speaking, a cold, sick feeling spreading through her chest. She thought of Reginald's calculating eyes in the library doorway, the satisfied curve of his mouth as he had looked between herself and Alexander, and understood with sudden, terrible clarity that he had been planning this from the very moment he arrived. "I need to speak with the Duke," Alina said, though even as she said it, doubt crept into her voice. Would he believe her against the weight of an entire household's whispers? Or would the old wound of Charlotte's betrayal make him quick to believe the worst, quick to protect himself the only way he knew how, by pulling away before he could be hurt again? She did not have long to wonder. That evening, Alexander summoned her to his study, and the moment she stepped through the door, she understood that the warmth of their last conversation in the library had vanished entirely, replaced by the same guarded coldness she had first encountered on her third night at Ashcombe Castle. "Your Grace," She curtsied carefully, searching his face for some trace of the man who had knelt before her chair and spoken her name so gently only days before. She found nothing but stone. "Miss Whitmore." His voice was flat, controlled, and it struck her like a physical blow, the sudden distance in it. "Serious accusations have been brought to my attention regarding your conduct in this household. I am obligated to look into them." "Accusations that are false, Your Grace. I have taken nothing, and I have never once used your mother's illness for my own gain. I care for her deeply, and I would never." "A bracelet is missing from my mother's room," he said, cutting through her protests, his eyes searching her face with an intensity that felt less like accusation now and more like desperate hope that she would give him a reason not to believe the worst. "One of considerable value. And several members of the staff have reported unusual sums of money, unaccounted for in the household ledgers since your arrival. I have not touched your mother's bracelet, and I know nothing about any missing money. Your Grace, please, you must know I would never do such a thing." "I do not know what to believe any more," Alexander said, and there was something raw and pained beneath the coldness of his voice now. A crack in the wall that told her the accusations had cut far deeper than money or jewelry, that they had struck at the oldest, rawest wound he carried, the fear that anyone who claimed to care for him was only ever waiting for the right moment to take advantage and disappear. "I have been wrong before, Miss Whitmore. I trusted someone completely, and it cost me more than I care to admit. I cannot afford to make that mistake again." "I am not Charlotte," Alina said, her voice shaking now, though whether from fear or anger she could not have said. "I have never once given you reason to compare me to her." Something flickered across his face at her words, pain, perhaps, or a flash of the man who had knelt before her only days ago, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared, smothered beneath the careful control he had spent 5 years perfecting. "I want to believe you," he said quietly. "I do. But I have a household to manage, a reputation to protect, and a mother whose well-being I will not risk on faith alone. Until this matter is resolved, I think it best that you keep to your duties and nothing more. No more evenings in the library. No more," he stopped himself, jaw tightening, unable or unwilling to finish the thought. Alina felt something break quietly in her chest, though she kept her face carefully composed, refusing to let him see how deeply his words had wounded her. "I understand, Your Grace," she said softly, and turned to leave before the tears building behind her eyes could fall in front of him. She did not sleep that night. She lay awake in her small room, listening to the wind pick up outside her window, and thought of everything she had allowed herself to hope for in the past weeks. A home, a place she belonged, perhaps even a love she had never believed herself worthy of, and felt it all slipping away beneath the weight of lies she had never told and accusations she could not begin to disprove. She did not yet know that Reginald had planted the missing bracelet himself, tucking it carefully among her few belongings while she had been occupied with Lady Margaret's evening care, ready to be discovered the moment it would do the most damage. She did not yet know how carefully he had studied the household's weaknesses, how patiently he had waited for the right moment to strike at the fragile trust building between Alina and the Duke. She only knew that the warmth she had found in this cold castle had turned to ash almost overnight, and that she no longer had the first idea how to prove her innocence against whispers too clever to be traced back to their source. The following morning, the bracelet was found among her things during a search Mrs. Prescott insisted upon, following what she claimed was an anonymous tip from a concerned member of staff. Alina's protests of innocence fell on ears already half convinced by weeks of careful, poisonous rumor, and though Lady Margaret fought fiercely in her defense, weak as she was, even her voice could not fully drown out the doubt that had settled over the household like a fog that refused to lift. Alexander said nothing when the bracelet was brought before him. He only looked at Alina for a long, silent moment, something broken and uncertain in his eyes, before turning away without a word, and in that silence, Alina understood, with a grief that settled deep and heavy in her chest, that whatever fragile thing had begun to grow between them in the firelit library had been extinguished, perhaps beyond repair, by a lie clever enough to exploit the one wound neither of them had ever fully healed. In the days that followed, Ashcombe Castle became a different place entirely for Alina, one where every hallway felt narrower, every glance sharper, every silence heavier than it had been before. She continued her duties with Lady Margaret out of love for the old woman rather than obligation. But she did so under a cloud of suspicion, so thick it seemed to follow her from room to room, whispered about behind closed doors, discussed in hushed tones, the moment she passed out of earshot. Lady Margaret, for her part, refused to believe a word of the accusations against her, and said so loudly and often, to anyone who would listen. "I have known thieves in my life," she told Mrs. Prescott sharply, on more than one occasion. "This girl is not one of them. You are all being led by the nose by someone with far more reason to lie than she has." But even Lady Margaret's fierce loyalty could not undo the damage that had already been done. The staff remained wary, the whispers continued, and worst of all, Alexander himself seemed to retreat further behind his walls with each passing day, avoiding Alina entirely, speaking to her only when matters concerning his mother's care made it absolutely necessary, and even then with a careful, painful distance that told her more clearly than words ever could how thoroughly the doubt had taken root in him. It was Reginald, of course, who seemed most pleased by the turn of events, though he was careful never to let his satisfaction show too plainly. He made a point of finding Alina alone whenever the opportunity arose, offering false sympathies that dripped with poorly disguised malice. "Such an unfortunate business," he said to her one afternoon, cornering her near the servants' stairwell with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "I do hope it all resolves itself soon, though I confess I've always found it rather difficult to trust a person who arrives with nothing and leaves, quite suddenly, with rather a lot more than they started with." "I have taken nothing that wasn't mine, Mr. Ashcombe," Alina said coldly, though her hands trembled slightly at her sides. "And I think you know that better than anyone in this house." Something flickered behind his eyes, surprise, perhaps, that she had dared to speak so plainly, or perhaps the faintest flicker of alarm that she suspected the truth. But he recovered quickly, his smile widening into something almost admiring. "Clever girl," he murmured. "But cleverness alone won't save you here. My cousin has been burned before, Miss Whitmore, and burned men do not stay near open flames for long, no matter how much they might wish otherwise. You would do well to remember that before this house finishes what it has already started." He left her standing alone in the narrow stairwell, shaking with a mixture of anger and fear she could barely contain, understanding now with terrible certainty that he had orchestrated every whisper, every accusation, every carefully placed piece of evidence, purely to protect his own claim to a title he feared losing should Alexander ever find happiness enough to marry and produce an heir. She tried in the days that followed to find some way to prove her innocence, some evidence that might undo the damage Reginald had so carefully constructed. But every attempt led nowhere. The household ledgers showed discrepancies too vague to trace to any single source. The staff who had once been friendly now avoided her eyes, unwilling to risk their own positions by defending someone the household had already half convicted in whispered judgment. And Alexander, the one person whose belief might have changed everything, remained locked behind a wall of silence that no amount of pleading seemed able to breach. She caught him alone only once during that difficult week, in the corridor outside his mother's room, and the desperation in her chest overrode every careful instinct that told her to remain composed. "Alexander, please," she said, catching his sleeve before he could walk past her. "You must know I would never hurt you or your mother or anyone in this house. Please look at me and tell me you truly believe I could do such a thing." He stopped, and for a moment something in his carefully guarded expression cracked, revealing the same raw pain she had glimpsed in the library that stormy night. "I do not know what I believe any more, Alina," he said quietly, and the use of her given name, soft and pained, nearly broke her entirely. "I want to believe you. Some part of me refuses to believe anything else, but I have been wrong before, so completely and so painfully wrong, that I no longer trust my own judgment where matters of the heart are concerned. I am sorry. I do not know how to fix that, not quickly, and not while an entire household stands convinced of your guilt. Then trust me anyway, she whispered. Trust yourself if you cannot yet trust the world around us. For a long, aching moment she thought he might reach for her, might finally choose to believe in something more than his own carefully built defenses. But then his jaw tightened, the wall rose once more behind his eyes, and he stepped back, putting distance between them that felt in that moment utterly unbridgeable. I need time, he said quietly. Please, Alina. Give me time to sort through this properly. She nodded, though something in her chest had already begun to understand, with a grief too heavy to voice. That time was not going to be enough. Not against a lie as carefully constructed as the one Reginald had built, and not against a wound as old and as deep as the one Charlotte had left behind. She watched him walk away down the corridor, and told herself, through tears she refused to let fall until she reached the privacy of her own small room, that she would find some way to endure this, that the truth would surface eventually, that she only needed to hold on a little longer. She did not yet know how much worse the coming days would become, nor how completely Reginald intended to finish what he had started. Not until the final, devastating accusation arrived less than a week later, an accusation so carefully crafted, so impossible to disprove, that it would leave Alina with no choice, but to do the one thing she had promised herself she would never do again. Disappear quietly into the night, without a word to anyone, believing herself unworthy of a place she had only ever wanted to call home. The final blow came on a cold morning in early December, delivered not by Reginald himself, but by Mrs. Prescott, who arrived at Alina's door with a folded letter and an expression that made Alina's stomach twist with dread before a single word had been spoken. This arrived for the Duke this morning, Mrs. Prescott said stiffly, holding out the letter. From a household in the South where you were previously employed. He asked that I show it to you before he decides how to proceed. Alina's hands shook as she unfolded the letter, and her heart sank as she read the words written there. An account, entirely false, claiming that she had been dismissed from her previous position under suspicion of theft, that her former employers had let her go quietly rather than risk a public scandal, that she had left with references she had no true right to carry. It was signed with a name Alina did not recognize, from a household she had never once worked for in her life. This is a lie, she said, her voice breaking despite her best efforts to remain composed. I have never even heard of this household, Mrs. Prescott. I don't understand who would write such a thing. I couldn't say, Mrs. Prescott replied, though something in her expression suggested she had her own suspicions she was unwilling to voice aloud. But the Duke has asked to see you in his study. Immediately. Alina's legs felt unsteady as she made her way through the familiar halls, the letter clutched tightly in her hand, her mind racing through every possible way to prove its falsehood, though she knew, with a sinking certainty, that a false letter from an unfamiliar household would be nearly impossible to disprove quickly, especially against a man already primed by past betrayal to expect the worst. Alexander was waiting for her in his study, standing near the window with his back to the door, his shoulders tense in a way that told her everything before he even turned around. Your Grace, her voice came out steadier than she felt, this letter is a fabrication. I have never worked for the household it claims, and I have no idea who would write such lies about me. He turned then, and the pain in his eyes struck her like a physical blow. Not anger, not accusation, but a deep, exhausted grief that told her he had already begun to believe the worst, not because he wanted to, but because it was easier, safer, than continuing to hope against every instinct that had protected him for the past 5 years. I want to believe you, he said quietly, echoing the words he had spoken days before, though they carried far less conviction now. But I cannot ignore a pattern, Alina. First the bracelet, now this letter. My household is in turmoil, my staff are frightened and suspicious, and my mother, he stopped, pressing a hand briefly to his eyes. My mother is not well, and I cannot risk further upheaval in this house, while she needs peace and rest above all else. So you believe it, Alina said softly, something breaking irreparably in her chest. After everything, you believe I am exactly what they say I am. I don't know what I believe, he said, and the honesty in his voice was somehow worse than outright accusation would have been. I only know that I cannot continue like this, caught between what I feel and what I fear, unable to trust my own judgment enough to know the difference. I need distance, Alina. Time to think clearly, away from whatever it is that clouds my judgment whenever I am near you. Distance, Alina repeated hollowly. You mean you want me gone? I mean I do not know what I want, he said, his voice cracking slightly, the first true crack she had seen in his composure since this nightmare began. But I cannot continue to defend you against evidence I cannot disprove, not while doubt eats away at everything I thought I understood about trust, about love, about my own judgment. I am sorry, Alina. I am so sorry. But I think for now it would be best if you considered other employment. The words landed like a physical blow, and Alina felt something inside her go very quiet and very still. The same quiet stillness she had learned to retreat into as a child, whenever the world proved once again that it was safer to expect nothing than to hope for anything at all. I understand, Your Grace, she said, her voice steady now, flat, the careful composure of someone who had learned long ago how to survive heartbreak by refusing to feel it fully in the moment. I will make arrangements to leave as soon as possible. Alina, his voice caught, something desperate entering it as she turned toward the door, as though some part of him already regretted the words the moment they had left his mouth. This isn't, I don't want you to think that I. It's all right, Your Grace. She did not turn back to face him, unwilling to let him see the tears finally beginning to fall. You have a household to protect and a mother to think of. I understand completely. I have always understood that people like me are meant to be useful and then forgotten once we become inconvenient. I should have known better than to hope for anything different. She left his study with her head held high, though her chest felt as though it had been carved hollow, and she did not look back, not once, though she felt his eyes on her the entire length of the corridor, silent and aching and unable in that moment to find the words that might have stopped her. That night, Alina sat alone in her small room, staring at the single travel case she had arrived with all those months ago, and made the only decision that felt survivable in the wreckage of everything she had allowed herself to hope for. She would not wait to be formally dismissed, would not endure the pitying glances of a staff who had already half convicted her, would not stand by while Reginald celebrated a victory he had won through lies too clever to disprove. She would leave quietly before dawn, taking nothing but what she had arrived with, and disappear from Ashcombe Castle the same way she had disappeared from every other place that had ever taught her the danger of hoping for a home. She wrote a short letter to Lady Margaret, the only person in that house who had never once doubted her, thanking her for a kindness Alina would carry with her for the rest of her life. She did not write to Alexander. There was nothing left to say that would not break her entirely before she had even left the castle grounds. The storm that had been building over the hills all evening broke just as she slipped out through the servants' entrance before dawn, rain beginning to fall in cold, heavy sheets as she made her way down the long drive on foot, her single case clutched tightly against her chest, her heart shattered but her steps steady, determined to put as much distance as possible between herself and the home she had never truly been allowed to have. She did not know, as she walked away into the storm, that within hours the truth would finally come to light, that Lady Margaret, refusing to accept her son's decision without a fight, would corner Reginald in the library with an accusation so direct and so unflinching that he would break entirely under the pressure, confessing everything in a desperate, cowardly attempt to save himself from a punishment far worse than exposure. She did not know that Alexander, upon hearing the truth, would feel the ground fall away beneath him with a horror and a grief more consuming than anything Charlotte's betrayal had ever caused him. She only knew that she was walking away from Ashcombe Castle in silence, into a storm that seemed determined to match the devastation in her own heart, believing herself forgotten by the one place she had finally, foolishly, allowed herself to call home. Lady Margaret had never been a woman who accepted defeat quietly, and illness had done nothing to dull the sharpness of her mind. The moment Mrs. Prescott informed her, with obvious reluctance, that Alina had been asked to leave the household, The old woman had risen from her bed with more strength than she had shown in weeks, refusing all assistance, and made her way directly to the library, where she knew she would find Reginald enjoying a glass of brandy by the fire, entirely too pleased with himself for a man who had done nothing productive in weeks. "You will tell me the truth," Lady Margaret said, her voice carrying a steel that startled even the servants who happened to be nearby. "Or I will see to it personally that you never set foot on Ashcombe land again, title or no title." Reginald's smile faltered slightly at the sight of her, standing in the doorway with an intensity that belied her frail frame. "Aunt Margaret, I don't know what you mean." "Do not insult me with lies, Reginald. I have known you since you were a boy sneaking sweets from my kitchen, and I know precisely the look on your face when you have done something you are ashamed of. That bracelet did not walk itself into that girl's belongings, and I very much doubt any household in the South sent a letter about a woman they have never employed. Tell me the truth, now, or I promise you will regret it far more than you will regret my son's disappointment." Something in her unwavering certainty seemed to finally crack whatever confidence Reginald had built around his careful scheme, and after a long, tense silence, his shoulders sagged, the charming mask slipping away to reveal something far more petty and desperate underneath. "I never meant for it to go this far," he said quietly, staring into his brandy rather than meeting her eyes. "I only meant to create enough doubt that Alexander would send her away before things became serious. I could not risk him marrying, having an heir, cutting me out of the succession entirely. You must understand, Aunt Margaret, I have very little else in this world besides the possibility of that title someday. So you destroyed an innocent girl's reputation, and very nearly my son's chance at happiness, over a title you have no true claim to inherit unless my son dies without children." Lady Margaret's voice shook with fury now, all pretense of calm abandoned. "You planted that bracelet yourself. You forged that letter. You built an entire campaign of lies against a woman who has done nothing but care for this family with more genuine kindness than you have shown in the whole of your miserable, grasping life." Reginald said nothing, his silence confirmation enough, and Lady Margaret turned without another word, calling for a footman to fetch her son immediately, her heart pounding with a fear far greater than any illness had ever caused her. The fear that this confession had come too late to undo the damage already done. Alexander arrived within minutes, his expression tightening into something cold and dangerous as his mother recounted Reginald's confession, word for word, watching his cousin's face for any sign of denial that never came. "You did this," Alexander said slowly, his voice deceptively quiet, the kind of quiet that came before a storm broke entirely loose. "You destroyed her deliberately to protect a title that was never yours to protect." "Alexander, please, I only wanted—" "I do not care what you wanted." The words came out low and hard, years of careful control finally cracking entirely under the weight of a grief and fury he could no longer contain. "You watched me fall in love with her. You watched me finally, after 5 years, allow myself to trust someone again, and you decided to destroy it, coldly and deliberately, because it threatened something you have no true right to. Get out of my house, Reginald, now. And do not return, not for holidays, not for emergencies, not for my mother's funeral when that terrible day eventually comes. You are no longer welcome here." Reginald opened his mouth as if to argue, but something in Alexander's expression, a raw, dangerous grief that had finally broken through every careful wall he had built, silenced him entirely, and he left the room without another word, gathering his things within the hour and departing Ashcombe Castle in disgrace, never to return. But Alexander had no time to dwell on his cousin's departure, no time to process the fury still burning through his chest, because the moment Reginald's carriage disappeared down the drive, a new and far more urgent fear had already begun to consume him entirely. "Where is she?" he asked his mother, his voice tight with a desperation that startled even himself. "Where is Alina now?" Lady Margaret's face fell and she reached for the folded letter on her bedside table, holding it out with trembling hands. "She left before dawn, Alexander, on foot in this storm. She left me this and nothing more. "I am so sorry, my darling. I did not know, not until it was already too late, and by then she was already gone." Alexander read the short letter twice, his heart breaking further with every gentle, gracious word Alina had written, thanking his mother for a kindness she believed she would never experience again, and understood, with a horror that clawed at his chest, exactly what his cold, careful distance had driven her to do. He thought of the storm raging outside, hours old now, the roads treacherous and cold, and felt a fear unlike anything he had experienced since the day Charlotte had disappeared. Except this fear was worse, so much worse, because this time he understood completely that the woman walking alone into that storm had done nothing wrong at all. She had only trusted him, had only allowed herself to hope, and he had repaid that trust with doubt and distance at the exact moment she had needed him most. "Call for my horse," he said, already moving toward the door, his voice sharp with an urgency that sent the household staff scrambling. "Immediately." "Alexander, the storm," his mother began. But he was already gone, striding through the halls with a purpose he had not felt in years, pulling on his heaviest coat as a groom rushed to saddle his fastest horse in the courtyard, rain lashing down around them both with a violence that would have stopped a more cautious man in his tracks. But Alexander Ashcombe had spent 5 years being cautious, 5 years protecting himself from every possible hurt by refusing to want anything badly enough to risk losing it, and he understood now, with a clarity that cut through every careful wall he had built, that caution had cost him more than any risk ever could have. He would not make that mistake again, not tonight. Not when the woman he loved was walking alone into a storm because of his own foolish, wounded pride. He mounted his horse in the pouring rain, the animal skittish and nervous beneath him, and turned its head toward the long, dark road leading away from Ashcombe Castle, toward whatever direction Alina might have taken in her grief and determination to disappear. "Alina," he called into the storm, his voice swallowed almost immediately by the roar of wind and rain, but he called anyway, again and again, spurring his horse forward into the darkness with a desperation that came from somewhere far deeper than duty or reputation or any of the careful concerns that had once governed his every decision. Alina. He did not know which road she had taken. He did not know how far she had walked, or whether she was safe, or whether he would find her at all before the storm or the cold or her own broken heart carried her somewhere he could never reach. He only knew that he could not stop searching, not while there was still breath in his body and hope, however fragile, that he might still find her in time. The storm raged on around him, indifferent to his desperation, and Alexander rode through it without slowing, calling her name into the darkness over and over again, praying with every hoofbeat that somewhere out there she could still hear him. Alina had been walking for hours by the time exhaustion finally began to overtake her, her clothes soaked through, her feet aching, her single travel case grown heavier with every mile until she could barely bring herself to lift it any longer. She had taken the road toward the village where she had once boarded a coach on her way to Ashcombe, hoping to find some way south, some way to disappear into a life far removed from dukes and castles, and the terrible, foolish hope she had allowed herself to feel for the first time in years. The storm showed no sign of relenting, and somewhere in the darkness, Alina had stopped trying to hold back her tears, letting them mix freely with the rain streaming down her face, grief and exhaustion pressing down on her until each step forward felt like an act of pure will rather than any true desire to keep moving. She thought of Lady Margaret's kind eyes, of the warm fire in the library, of Alexander's voice speaking her name so gently that stormy night weeks ago, and felt each memory cut through her like a fresh wound, reminders of a home and a love she had allowed herself to believe might finally be hers, only to have it stripped away by lies she had never had the power to disprove. She was so lost in her grief that she almost did not hear it at first, a sound cutting through the storm, faint and distant, carried on the wind from somewhere behind her. She stopped, turning slowly, straining to listen over the roar of rain and thunder, and felt her heart stutter painfully in her chest as the sound grew clearer, unmistakable now, cutting through the darkness with a desperate, familiar urgency. Alina. She stood frozen in the middle of the muddy road, rain streaming down her face, certain for a moment that grief and exhaustion had finally driven her to imagining things. But the sound came again, closer now, accompanied by the unmistakable thunder of hoofbeats approaching fast through the storm, and then she saw him, a dark shape emerging from the sheeting rain, riding hard, his voice raw from calling her name into the night. Alexander! Her voice came out barely above a whisper, disbelief warring with a hope she was almost afraid to feel. He saw her then, and something in his posture changed entirely, urgency turning to a desperate relief as he pulled his horse to a hard stop and swung down from the saddle before the animal had even fully halted, closing the distance between them at a run through the mud and rain. Elena, her name came out broken, half a sob as he reached her, his hands coming up to cup her face as though he needed to confirm she was truly real, truly standing before him. I thought I had lost you. I thought, God, Elena, I am so sorry. I am so sorry I did not trust you when you needed me to most. Alexander, what are you doing here? How did you even? Reginald confessed everything, he said, his voice still shaking, rainwater streaming down his face, mixing with what Elena realized with a jolt of disbelief might have been tears of his own. My mother forced the truth out of him. He planted that bracelet himself. He forged that letter. All of it, every last accusation, was a lie meant to destroy any chance of happiness I might find with you, because he feared losing his claim to the title. His hands tightened gently against her face, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that stole her breath entirely. I should have trusted you from the very beginning. I should have trusted what I felt, instead of letting old wounds convince me that trust always ends in betrayal. I am so sorry, Elena. I have never been more sorry for anything in my entire life. Elena felt something break open in her chest, grief and relief and disbelief all tangled together until she could hardly breathe through the force of it. You rode out into a storm, she said softly, in the middle of the night calling my name to find me. I would have ridden through worse than this, he said fiercely. I would have searched every road in this country if it meant finding you and telling you the truth that I love you, Elena. Completely foolishly, more than I ever believed myself capable of loving anyone again. I was a coward when it mattered most, and I let fear cost me the one thing I have wanted more than anything in 5 years. Please, I am asking you, with everything I have left, come home. Not as a companion, not as an employee. Come home as the woman I love, and give me the chance to prove that I will never again let doubt or fear come between us. Tears mixed freely with rain on Elena's face as she looked up at him, and she felt the last of her carefully guarded defenses finally give way entirely. The same walls she had built around her own heart since childhood, taught by loss after loss that hoping for a home only ever led to disappointment. But standing here, in the middle of a raging storm, looking into the eyes of a man who had ridden through the night calling her name until he found her, she understood that some walls were meant to fall, and that some risks, however frightening, were worth taking with your whole heart. I love you too, she whispered, and watched relief and joy break across his face like sunlight finally breaking through storm clouds. I have loved you for weeks, even when I was too afraid to admit it, even when the whole world seemed determined to convince me I didn't deserve to. He kissed her then, there in the pouring rain, gentle and desperate and full of every unspoken word between them. And Elena felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that she had finally found a place in the world where she truly belonged. They rode back to Ashcombe Castle together as the storm finally began to break, the worst of the wind and rain giving way to a soft, steady drizzle that seemed almost gentle by comparison. Elena wrapped safely in Alexander's coat, held close against him as his horse carried them both home through the last of the night's darkness. Lady Margaret was waiting for them in the entrance hall when they arrived, her frail form wrapped in blankets despite the late hour, refusing to rest until she knew for certain that Elena had been found safe. The moment she saw them come through the door together, soaked and exhausted but unmistakably radiantly happy, she let out a sound that was half laugh and half sob, reaching for Elena's hands with a warmth that told her, more clearly than any words could have, that she was truly welcome home. I told you, Lady Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. that you were the first person in years who might finally reach him. I am only glad my foolish son came to his senses before it was too late to prove me right." Alina laughed through her own tears. Exhaustion and joy tangled together in a way that left her feeling lighter than she had in years, and allowed herself, finally, completely, to believe that the home she had found at Ashcombe Castle was one she would never again have reason to leave. The weeks that followed brought a change to Ashcombe Castle so complete that even the oldest members of the staff remarked they had never seen the old halls feel so alive. Word of Reginald's disgrace spread quietly through the household, and though a few servants had once doubted Alina, most were quick to offer quiet apologies once the truth became known, ashamed of how easily they had believed cruel rumors over the quiet kindness they had witnessed from her every single day. Clara, who had never once wavered in her support, hugged Alina so tightly the day the truth came out that neither of them could speak for laughing and crying at once. Lady Margaret's health, strengthened perhaps by sheer stubborn joy, improved steadily through the winter months, enough that she insisted on attending every planning meeting for the wedding that followed only a few months later. Offering opinions on everything from flowers to the exact shade of blue she believed suited Alina best, delighted beyond words to finally see her son happy again after so many long, guarded years. Alexander proposed properly on a clear winter morning in the same walled garden where he had first admitted, hesitantly, that he had begun walking toward wherever Alina happened to be. He knelt among the bare rose bushes, now dusted lightly with frost, and told her that he no longer feared wanting things, not when the thing he wanted most was standing in front of him, offering a love more patient and more honest than anything he had believed himself capable of receiving again. Their wedding was a quiet, warm affair, held in the castle's great hall with Lady Margaret seated proudly at the front, Clara serving as one of Alina's few but cherished attendants, and the entire household gathered to celebrate a match that had, against every early obstacle, proven itself worth fighting for. There was no whisper of scandal that day, no shadow of doubt or rumor, only genuine joy, radiating through every corner of a castle that had, for so long, felt more like a fortress than a home. Reginald was never spoken of again in polite company, his name quietly removed from conversation, as though the household had collectively agreed to let his memory fade into insignificance, exactly as he deserved. He never returned to Ashcombe Land, and in time, even the servants who remembered his scheming struggled to recall the details of his disgrace. So thoroughly had happiness replaced the shadow he had once cast over the household. Alina settled into her new life slowly, learning the responsibilities of her new position with the same quiet diligence she had brought to every task before it, though now she carried herself with a confidence she had never quite possessed as a companion with no family and no fortune to her name. She continued to sit with Lady Margaret often, not out of duty now, but out of genuine affection, and the old woman delighted in teaching her the finer points of managing a great household, insisting always that Alina's natural kindness would serve her far better than any formal training ever could. Alexander, too, changed in ways the household noticed and quietly celebrated. The careful distance he had once kept from nearly everyone softened considerably, replaced by a warmth that reminded the older staff, the ones who remembered him as a younger man, of who he had been before Charlotte's betrayal had taught him to guard his heart so fiercely. He laughed more often now, truly laughed, the kind that shook a room, exactly as his mother had once described him being before everything changed. He walked the gardens with Alina in the evenings, sat with her by the library fire without fear of what vulnerability might cost him, and found, much to his own quiet astonishment, that trusting someone completely did not have to end in betrayal after all, that sometimes, if a person was patient and brave enough, it could lead instead to exactly the kind of home he had long ago given up hope of finding. Years later, when their own children ran laughing through the same halls that had once felt so cold and guarded, Alina would sometimes think back to that terrible night in the storm, to the moment she had believed herself forever unworthy of the home she had found, and feel a quiet, grateful wonder at how close she had come to walking away from it forever. But then she would hear Alexander's laughter drifting through the castle, warm and unguarded, or catch Lady Margaret telling their children stories of the storm that had once nearly torn their family apart. And she would remember with a certainty that never wavered, that some loves were worth every storm it took to find them, and that a man who would ride through the darkest night calling your name, refusing to stop until he found you, was a man worth building an entire lifetime of quiet, unshaken trust around. And so, in the end, Ashcombe Castle became exactly what it had always been meant to be. Not a fortress guarding against the world, but a true and lasting home, filled at last with the warmth, laughter, and unshakable love that both Alina and Alexander had once believed themselves too broken, too cautious, or too unworthy to ever truly deserve.